The reason why we're talking about momentum and speed and accuracy, they wanted to inflict the largest wound possible in a different form or fashion than any broadhead or arrow made. So they really weren't in it to try to get another 10 or 15 feet per second. They weren't in it to try to take a 1.5 inch cut to 1 3/4 or make a mechanical go from 2 inches to 2.5. They were in it to really replicate the ballistics of a bullet. And so when you take a look at a bullet, right, inflicts an entry wound. It inflicts percussion. In other words, it's traveling faster than the speed of sound, so it expands internally. And then it has a different dynamic as it exits an animal. And so they wanted to replicate the down power of a rifle with an arrow.
Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 265, The Arrow and the Broadhead, with David Hand from Slash Arrows. Hunt Tech Part 5. Support for the Big Buck Registry and the Deer Hunt Podcast comes from Rackology. Everything you need in one bag. Now available at Rural King and Orslin Farm and Home storefronts. Or online at www.rackology.org. Hunter's Blend Coffee. Defending hunting one cup at a time. Finally, there's a coffee that helps rather than hurts your freedom to hunt. Use the code BBR to receive 10% off your next Hunter's Blend order. Polar Works Coolers and the Chill Zone, specializing in the most durable, reliable thermal cups and coolers. Keep your drinks hot or cold in any element. Covert Scouting Cameras, remote cameras for hunting, wildlife, and security. Morse's Sporting Goods, a full line of sporting goods without the sales tax. And Big Buck merch. You can get cool, high-quality Big Buck t-shirts, long-sleeve t-shirts, and hoodies. And show support for this podcast by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/MERCH. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
This is John Eberhardt. I've been hunting out of the saddle since 1981. I'm about to listen to my favorite podcast, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hey, this is Zach Sandau at OnX Hunt, and you're listening to one of my personal favorite podcasts, the Big Buck Registry.
Hey guys, this is Dan Bates with Tuned In Archery, the timeman and inventor of the Hang On Helper. You're listening to my favorite show. It's about to be yours, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen and fellow predators. My name is Jay, and thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. For Dusty Phillips and Jim Keller and the entire staff here at the Big Buck Registry, welcome to this week's show. There are a couple things I'd like you to do for us if you could. If you would, please check us out on iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. With your help, we're going to try and push this show up the iTunes charts. I know we have a lot of listeners out there, and I need you to take some action. I need you to leave a review and subscribe to the show. If you do subscribe, that'll give you access and notification each and every week that a new show is released. You can also access this show in its entirety on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. It's all right there for you to access on demand at your fingertips. Regarding the harness program, we have an ample supply of harnesses to give away from our volunteer donors. If you're in need of a full-body harness, please send an email to jay@bigbuckregistry.com. Over the past 4 episodes of our Hunt Tech mini-series, we've explored a deer movement prediction app with the Drury's and their new app called Deercast, the on-demand action camera with Aaron Stonehocker from Tactacam, a game camera picture data processing system with Jon Livingston from DeerLab, and mapping and waypoint technology with Zach Sandau from OnX Hunt. Now we move on to the arrow and the broadhead with David Hand from Slash Arrows. The earliest evidence of an arrow launched from a bow dates back some 10,000 years, and we've seen some amazing arrow and broadhead advancements in technology since the aluminum arrow was first introduced. Every year, there seems to be a new and innovative arrow and broadhead design, and David Hand may have one of the most innovative designs in recent years. We asked David to join us to explore all the innovations over the last 20 years, where things are today, and what the future of the arrow and the broadhead looks like for archery hunters. We'll get to our entire interview with David Hand in just one moment, but before we do, let's hear from our friends at Rackology, Polarworks Coolers, and Jim Keller with the Deer News.
I still can't believe that's all you're taking.
I got everything I need all in one bag.
Rackology Deer Supplement and Attractant, developed through years of intense scientific research, comes a product that puts it all in one bag. Superior attractant, scientifically formulated vitamins and minerals, and all at a much better price. To get yours today, please check out rackology.org for a list of dealers. Rackology, how can you afford not to use it? Everything deer need, all in one bag.
I always wanted one of those high-end coolers because of the quality that I had heard of, but I couldn't justify the price. Then I found Polarworks. Finally, I found a company that understands quality and affordability. The Polarworks lineup is extensive and is filled with Polar cups, Polar tubs, and Polar soft coolers. So check out Polarworks.com when you're considering your next high-quality cooler without breaking the bank. That's www.polarwerkz.com.
For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News. Our first story this week, Chris Brackett indicted on charges for illegally poaching 2 bucks in Indiana. This story is from the OutdoorHub.com website. The U.S. Attorney's Office, Central District of Illinois, released an announcement reporting Chris Brackett indicted on felony charges after allegedly taking one more deer than his hunting permit allows and then attempting to cover it up. The U.S. District Clerk of the court will schedule the date for Brackett to appear for arraignment in federal court in Peoria, Illinois. If convicted, as charged, the statutory maximum penalty for each offense, conspiracy to violate the Lacey Act, count 1, and a violation of the Lacey Act, count 2, is up to 5 years in prison and fines of up to $250,000. Both offenses are charged as felony offenses. The government is represented by Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Legge in the prosecution. The charges were investigated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the assistance of both the Illinois and Indiana Departments of Natural Resources. Members of the public are reminded that an indictment is merely an accusation. The defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. I don't know where they went. Number of Wisconsin deer hunters drops in 2018. This story is from the Fox 6 News website, as reported by Christina Van Zelst. The 2018 hunting season is almost over, but many hunters are still hoping to score a big buck. Despite that enthusiasm, the number of hunters heading to the woods has declined this year in Wisconsin. The number of deer spotted was low for some, but it seems the numbers of hunters dropped too. The report by the Wisconsin Policy Forum says the number of deer hunting licenses sold in the state has fallen. The Department of Natural Resources says sales are down as much as 6% since 1999. It's simply as with any other number of things connected to the baby boomer generation, which has a large population, said Wisconsin DNR Supervisor Jeff Pritzel. That population is moving out of not only hunting, but other activities. Over the course of decades, there's been a slight decline, said Pritzel. When we just look at the demographics of the Wisconsin population age structure, you can anticipate what's going to continue. Pritzel says more young people are becoming interested in hunting, meaning those numbers could possibly increase. As for local hunters, there's no such thing as too much ammo. That's why we have a 9-day gun season, said Mike Cole of Appleton. You got to enjoy it from beginning to end. Illinois hunters take 58,836 deer during opening firearm weekend. This story is from the State Journal-Register website. Hunters in Illinois harvested a preliminary total of 58,836 deer during the first weekend of the state's firearm deer season, November 16 through 18, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources reported on Wednesday. The 3-day total was 14% higher than last year's opening weekend for firearm hunting. A second long weekend for firearm hunting runs November 29th through December 2nd. Other deer hunting opportunities in the weeks ahead include muzzleloader-only deer season, which is December 7th through 9th, late winter antlerless only, and CWD deer seasons in select counties only, which run December 27th through 30th and January 18th through 20th. Archery season opens and continues through January 20th, but is closed November 29th through December 2nd in counties open for firearm deer season. For more details on deer hunting, open counties, and other information, check the IDNR website at www.dnr.illinois.gov. Possibly oldest deer jaw in North America found in Ellensburg, Washington. This story is from the Daily Record News website and was reported by Michael Gallagher. After spending roughly 4.9 million years in Ellensburg, the jawbone of a deer is making its way to the collection at the Burke Museum on the University of Washington campus in Seattle. We think it might be the oldest deer jaw in America, said Megan Weatherall, a paleontologist and lecturer at Central Washington University. While some paleontologists travel the world to uncover fossils at remote locations, Weatherall followed a different approach. Her husband found it on a class field trip a few blocks from campus. I'm an adjunct lecturer at Central, and we go to the fairgrounds to look at the Craigs Hill hillside, Weatherall said. One of the grad students, who happens to be my husband, saw it. Weatherall said they've been able to date the find by its location on the hillside. Weatherall said 2 other deer jawbones have been found of similar age, but slightly younger in North America, one in Hanford, Washington, and the other in Florida. We think the deer came across the Bering Sea land bridge, and this is another piece of evidence to support that, she said. Weatherall said over time fossils can be exposed, explaining why this one, about 3 inches long, went uncovered for almost 5 million years. Weatherall said the hillside is eroding, so people are cautioned not to dig into the hillside looking for bones. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Well, thanks to Jim Keller for the Deer News. Without further ado, here is David Hand from Slash Arrows. David Hand, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, my friend?
Well, thank you for having me. We really appreciate the great work you do, Jay, and informing all the advocates of hunting and archery. And I think it's a very important space that needs to grow.
I love archery, man, and it's one of those subject matters that, you know, we attend ATA, you know, and we go there and we meet friends, but I mean, at the root of that, it's all about the advancement of archery, and the technology that is coming through is tremendous. And as part of our technology series, we'd be remiss if we didn't speak of the evolution of the arrow and the broadhead, and talk about how we are using it today and what advancements have taken place over the last, 20, 30 years to bring us where we are now. So I think you're a perfect person to discuss this matter.
Oh, thank you. We've done a lot of hard work in the archery area over the last 10 years and a couple of studies at major universities, and so we look forward to sharing it with you today.
Very cool. So, David, tell me about yourself. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? How'd you get into this space of archery technology?
Like most of the listeners out there, I probably haven't actively hunted with a gun since I was a kid. Shot mainly slingshots and bows and arrows. And so we've hunted, mainly here in Texas, some out of state. But as you know, in fact, I'm looking at the statistics today, we've got one of the largest deer populations in the world, 4.6 million, up from just 4.2, and we've got a little over 800,000 hunters. So I always was an avid hunter, always shot with a bow. Background was that mechanical engineer, spent a fair amount of time, building cars. And so, I was pretty much an advocate for the first 20 years of my career, just hunting like most of the audience. And so realized about 10 years ago that I thought that the bows and crossbows have really outpaced the technology of the arrow and the broadhead. And so decided to get into the space on a professional basis and took it to university. And then, as you know, we have a little over 7 patents today in the space.
Gotcha. So we're talking about, there's been advancements in bow technology and crossbow technology, right? And that in and of itself it should be its own separate podcast. Today, we want to talk specifically about arrow technology and specifically about broadhead technology. The advancements from even when I shot as a kid, I don't even remember what I was shooting. I had a bear that I bought out of the Sears catalog, and I don't know what kind of arrows went with it. I didn't care. I just wanted to see if I could hit the target, back then. And I think it cost me $100, as I recall. And I thought it was fantastic because it was probably one of the early compound bows on the market. And this was Well, we're talking, I was 8 years old at the time. So where does the arrow begin? I mean, from a modern standpoint, when do we adopt a technology that at that time was a big movement in archery?
Yeah, I think the big movement, you're right. I remember the days when we were young and, when we shot arrows, we would just make them longer or shorter, which depending on whether they hit the target to the left or the right. That was kind of our
right.
Basic knowledge of tuning. And, we were dealing with basically the hyperbolic curve, because the arrow was going across the riser of the bow. And so the stiffness of the arrow, the length of the arrow, the weight of the arrow was really sensitive. And we really didn't know much. I remember I'd take, 12 arrows and gosh, 6 of them shot good. And the other 5 or 6, I'd try to shorten or lengthen or make them a little heavier to get them to shoot straight. And if they didn't, I just threw them away and just shot with the best 6 I had.
Right.
And then Jay, I think the big turning point was, the cam, the first cam we put on bows. And, then Rambo came out with the movie, and I think that just kind of started the whole progression.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, Katniss now, has lifted it. We talk a lot about that at APA, what Hollywood's done for us.
Right. That's a good point.
That's kind of where we were. We were shooting this 130, 140 feet per second. Somebody got a cam up there, and we jumped it up to 160, 180. And, Easton came out with 22-19s and 21-17s, and those arrows weighed a lot. And we took close shots, and we had 7/8-inch broadheads, and the regulation said we had to have 40 pounds in most states and a 7/8-inch broadhead. And the reason that is you do the math, and still today it takes about 40 pounds of kinetic energy, or about a 40-pound pull, and a 7/8-inch 3-bladed broadhead will make some pretty good penetration if you have a heavy arrow.
Gotcha. Okay.
If you have a heavy arrow, and we're going to have to talk about that, because I think that's where the industry took a turn that needed to change.
Well, just to discuss a little bit about the construction of the aluminum arrow, for those that are not familiar, that might just be getting into this, can you tell us what the importance of an aluminum arrow, the 22-17s, all those numbers mean something. Can you just describe what that meant? And there's all kinds of variations. Well, what does it mean when I say 22-17?
Yeah, what they were doing is they were trying to give you the diameter, and then the 17 or 19, equates to the wall thickness. And some of the thinner wall thicknesses were 14s, and some of the heavier wall thicknesses were 19s and 21s, being thousandths. Now, as we went forward, you take a look at that, the industry started rounding those numbers up and down, so they weren't exactly 14 thousandths or 17 thousandths or 19 thousandths. But that somewhat determined, what the weight of the arrow was, what the stiffness of the arrow was, what the quality of the arrow was relative to its breaking strength.
Okay.
And it was an extruded process, fairly accurate. And so that's how we got there. That's basically how we got there. There wasn't anything that was a micro diameter at that time, less than a quarter of an inch round like we have today, because you just couldn't get the aluminum to, have the right characteristics. And at the same time back then, those arrows needed to be fairly stiff, because, we're still shooting across the riser. We don't have drop away rest. We don't have whisker biscuits. We don't have center shot bows. We don't have parallel cams. I mean, now we're still, even as we're going into this cam era, we're taking that era, across that riser, and it takes, pretty good ways for that arrow to correct, right? It's going to come out of that bow in a bend, and it's going to wobble back and forth. And, if you take a real close shot, you could see the arrow going left or right on a piece of paper, and eventually, downrange it would steady out. That's kind of where we were. We were shooting, somewhere around, under a couple hundred feet per second. We were using a heavy arrow. But I want to remind you that even at those slow speeds, we had a fair amount of momentum.
Okay.
We had a fair amount of momentum, and that while we couldn't take as long a shot, if it was maintaining 180, 190 feet per second, it was such a heavy arrow that wind, bushes, brush, it maintained that speed. It's a difference between a Volkswagen and a Mack truck. We were really, rolling Mack trucks down range at game. Pretty heavy projectiles.
All right. When you say that it hits the riser, I mean, what happens at that point? You're saying that it causes some kind of a friction that makes the arrow do funny things. It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, when you take an object from, at rest to being projected across the top of that riser, it's going to bend back and forth.
Yeah.
And even today in the studies we did at Rice University, we were still using high-speed photography to determine how long it takes that arrow to start flying straight. You can see it in a paper test. You can put a bow that's a little out of tune and shoot a piece of paper at, 5 feet or 10 feet or 15 feet, and it go left or right. So it takes a while for that arrow. At least back then, it took even longer because, it was coming across that riser, and that string was a little bit of an angle. But any object you take from 0 speed to 200 feet per second is going to have some back and forth.
Okay. All right. So is the aluminum arrow at that time, it was the best we had, right? For the span that we used the aluminum arrow exclusively, that was the best on the market.
Yeah, I think the downside to the aluminum arrow, right, was that it was heavy from the knock end all the way to the tip.
Okay.
And there really wasn't a way to make that arrow lighter in the back and heavier in the front. Because it was an extruded piece of metal, piece of aluminum. Now, there were higher grades of aluminum that allowed us to step into aluminum crossbolts later on.
Yep.
And, then there's some hybrids that came along. But basically, that's where we were. The states at the time, were basing, and this is important because we still have most of the states are basing their regulations on you shooting a fairly heavy arrow and a 7/8 inch broadhead. And what they were looking at is they were looking at the momentum, because at 40 or 50 pounds of pull at 180 or 200 feet per second with a heavy arrow, you're up there, close to that 13, 14, 15, foot-pounds a second. And we're going to talk about that because when we went to the carbon arrow, we lost that momentum.
Okay. All right. So the advancement went from aluminum to carbon. So you're saying that we've lost something with the carbon arrow that we had with aluminum.
Right. In fact, if you take a look at the state of Pennsylvania, and you go back in time and you look at when there was a movement from the aluminum era to the carbon era, there was a lot of concerns, at the state side that, hey, these arrows are getting too light. We've moved into an era where everybody's trying to get a little more speed, but we're not getting the penetration because we just don't basically have the raw momentum. Let me give you a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I have in front of me, a trade magazine, and I'll give a little shout out to our guys at Arrow Trade.
Yep.
And they measure the momentum of a light arrow versus a heavy arrow. And if you can think back in time, let's just say I'm shooting even a short draw and I'm shooting 50 pounds, they'll show that a light arrow only has about 10 foot-pounds per second, and a heavy area has 14 foot-pounds per second. Now, that's just raw momentum.
Right.
You think about the jump from 10 to 14. And so now you have a bunch of states out there saying, oh, my gosh, we've been used to seeing, 13, 14, 15, 16, even with 50, 60-pound bows that weren't as efficient as today. And now all of a sudden we're going to start giving people light arrows, and the momentum's going to go down 30, 40%. That's concerning. That's concerning. Probably so much so that some states started to say, I just don't know about a mechanical broadhead. If we're going to have a carbon arrow and we're going to have less momentum and it's going to hit that target, it's going to be like putting the brakes on. And we're really concerned about, large broadheads or mechanical broadheads when we're stepping from a heavy arrow to a light arrow.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the momentum and there's some other factors that you look at when, and this is kind of a sidetrack, I think, but why is momentum important, and how do you measure momentum? How do you achieve it?
Yeah, basically momentum is just the mass times the weight. And so traditionally, when we had an aluminum arrow, and I'm going to talk about an aluminum arrow because in carbon arrow it's different, a little different. In an aluminum arrow, every time we stepped up in weight, we went slower. But there's a certain point there where the trade-off of the speed is to your advantage. And that, would you trade off 10, 15 feet per second or 20 feet per second to pick up another 20 or 30% of momentum such that you're going to get a pass-through shot? And so momentum is actually when you put an object in motion, and it could be a tank or it could be a bowling ball is a great example. You put a bowling ball in motion, even at any speed, it takes a tremendous amount of resistance to stop that bowling ball.
Right.
If you lighten that up to a basketball, and even if you roll it down as fast as you could, it's not going to knock all the pins down.
Right.
And so I think what our regulators were doing at the time, and this is the transition we're going through in the late 70s and 80s now, they're saying, oh my gosh, this carbon's coming on board, and it's shooting faster, but it doesn't have the knockdown power.
Okay. All right. So when the carbon arrow was introduced and we had these concerns, or state regulators had these concerns, it still came on with force.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
What was the motivation behind the carbon arrow if the concern was we lose momentum and we can't continue these pass-through shots like a bowling ball would easily knock down bowling pins, but a basketball won't?
Yeah. So the carbon era started to afford us speed and weight with not as much compromise. And you need to think of it in this terms. We could take a arrow that weighs less, but we could put, and the target folks realize this pretty quick, we could put, 50, 60, 70 grains in forward insert. So now we had an arrow that weighed less than the aluminum arrow, but let's put the weight on the tip. And if we put the weight on the tip, I think you can recall when we were shooting 125 grain broadheads and 150 grain broadheads, 175 grain broadheads.
Yep.
This whole concept of, hey, we could shoot something light, pick up some speed. It would be dynamically more efficient. It would go across the riser and the carbon would react better and the spine would be better and the in-flight characteristics would be better and it'd be more accurate. And let's just put the weight on the tip. And that had some pros and cons, and we're going to have to talk about that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get into it right now then. What are the pros and cons that they were looking at as far as adding a lighter broadhead on a lighter arrow, but that doesn't react nearly as an aluminum would? Yeah.
So here's what so about that same time, you'll have to remember we're starting to see some pretty advanced cams. We had the hatchet cam come out. We had the solo cam come out. And so now we're starting to enter the speed game.
All right. What year was this approximately?
When did we first cross probably the 300 feet per second? Somewhere around that time period. That's what I'm talking about. We're down there 270, 280. That's about the same time 15 years ago, we started getting, hatchet cams. We started getting some cams by Darton. We started getting some cams by Matthews. We started getting some longer risers and shorter limbs.
Yeah.
By the way, we knew at that time we were going to get to 400 feet per second, but now I'm just going to stay in the high 200s, 300 feet per second barrier.
Okay. All right.
And so what we started to see when we started doing these carbon arrows is we needed to play the spine game, right? The general opinion was that a low poundage bow needed a lighter spine, and a heavier, arrow or heavier poundage bow with a more radical cam needed a stiffer arrow. And so we came out with spine charts. To remind the audience, spine charts, nothing, new. You take a 1.2 pounds, put it in the middle of a 30-inch arrow, and if it goes down a third of an inch, if it bends a third of an inch, it's a pretty rudimentary way to measure spine. We'll talk about the ways it's done today. It's a lot more accurate. But back then, we'd just go a third of an inch and we'd say, that's a 300 spine. And then if it went, 4/10 of an inch, we'd say that's a 400 spine. And if it went half an inch, we'd say that's a 500 spine. And so, that's when, so we started coming up with all these different spines for different poundage bows. And then at the bottom of those spine charts, we started to note, well, if you've got a radical cam, or you have a short brace height, or you're shooting an overdraw system, if you remember those that were published in the, the 90s, gosh, you probably ought to shoot a stiffer arrow. And then the theory came out that, if you have a long draw, you need a stiffer arrow too, because, long strings of carbon bend a whole lot easier than short strings of carbon.
Right.
So, that's when we were, and back then we had some speed, but then we still didn't have, quite the drop away rest perfected. We didn't have the whisker biscuits. We didn't have center shot bows. The cams were a little off center. We didn't have, the risers were still a little shorter than they are today. The limbs were still a little bit bigger. So, there was a whole industry in trying to tune that carbon era to your bow.
Okay. Gotcha. So that's around the early 2000s, right?
Yeah. And so then the theory started to develop, and Dr. Ashby came out with it that said, if you put more weight on the end of that arrow, then it's going to flex more.
Right.
Pretty common sense, but a lot of people neglected that, if you put a heavy broadhead on the end of that arrow, it's going to flex more than a light broadhead. And so we really lost, and in my opinion, that was a mistake, because we had some pretty good designs that were 125 and 150 grain broadhead. And then on the backside, we had some people that were producing 60 grain and 75 grain broadheads that also were very effective. And there's no reason why you can't have a pretty good sizable cut with something that weighs 60 or 75 grains. There's no reason to, even put 100 grains on the end of an arrow. And so Dr. Ashby's study, everybody started talking about front of center. How much weight can you put on the front of the arrow such that you have a front of center? And for those of you who want to know the simple math behind front of center, again, I'll take a 30-inch arrow, and you'll see people try to balance it on their finger. A center point to a 15-inch, a 30-inch arrow is 15 inches. If you go forward, and it's 12 inches now to the tip, you've moved it forward 3 inches over 30s, 10, so that's about a 10% FOC. And so there was this gravitation towards, maybe having a 10% FOC would give you more penetration as a hunter.
Okay. All right.
And we'll talk about today that number is closer to 15 or 20, and some of the crossbows are shooting 25%.
Okay. So take us out of the early 2000s. We've got the carbon arrow. We're looking at something that, and then there's lots of discussion because it changed the whole format of what the world had known in aluminum. Where does the carbon arrow go from there?
The carbon arrow, at this point in time, I told you earlier that, if you put weight on the end of that arrow and you have it static in your hand, and instead of it measuring a center point at 10, it measures it at 12, and that's a 10% front of center. Well, that's a pretty rudimentary assumption, right? Because now you're saying, here's an arrow standing still. But, when you put that arrow in flight and you put it out there at 320, 340 feet per second, you put it across different bows, where's that arrow actually bending? Where's the bend point on that arrow?
Right.
So, So we start to say, gosh, it's not really bending where we thought it was going to bend. And, what if instead of putting the weight on the tip of the arrow, we, started to look at, and we did this at Rice University in my study, what if we started to put that weight, behind the broadhead? What if we stiffened the first 3 or 4 inches of that arrow? Would the weight have a better payload capacity? In other words, would it be a faster arrow than just simply hanging more weight on the tip? And intuitively, the answer to that's yes, right? I mean, if you can put the weight distributed across the tip of the arrow rather than all on the tip of the arrow, you're going to get a better flight pattern.
So when you say the tip of the arrow, you mean a certain length of the arrow? Or you're talking about the width? What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of hanging, let's just say, instead of hanging 150 grain broadhead on the tip of the arrow, which would give you some flight problems, right? Because, that's a whole lot of weight right there at the tip to bend that arrow in flight.
Yep.
What if you said, gosh, I really like the penetration of 150 grains. Why don't I put 50 grains in the insert and then 100 on the tip? Or why don't I actually flip-flop the whole thing? Why don't I just go put a 75 grain broadhead on there and then put 75 grains, and let's use a micro diameter and make it, 3 or 4 or 5 inch long insert. And that's what we developed at Rice. That's when we started to say, we can pick up speed, we can pick up dynamic efficiency, we can pick up more front of center, and it's like it's free, right? Because now we have something that's fast and has momentum.
Gotcha. All right, so you're kind of backtracking into the arrow a little bit with the not the sleeve, but the insert itself. So gaining some weight there. So just on a side note, how do you measure an arrow bending in flight? Is it something that you look at with special equipment, or are you just looking at video? How do you determine that?
There's two ends of the equation. When it leaves the bow, before it leaves the bow, we were using high-speed photography.
Okay.
900 to 1,000 frames a second. And we were using some pretty low brace height bows, radical bows. At the time, this is 8 years ago, shooting 350, 360 feet per second, 5-inch brace heights, very radical cams, 80-pound bows, 85-pound bows, custom bows. And we're trying to see what's happening before the arrow even leaves, the bow. And then when it leaves the bow, we're trying to determine how long does it take that shaft to get to equilibrium. At some point where, that arrow is not in such a chaotic state. And then when it hits an object, and this is very important in hunting, what does it do when you impact bone? Is it gonna bend a lot? Is it gonna get penetration? So we were looking at the whole flight pattern, shooting it into, obviously, we were taking animal bones, we were taking real hide, we were doing high-speed photography on actual animals. Here in Texas, we're lucky that we have axis deer, fallow deer, hogs. So we have a lot of game that can be hunted year-round with high-speed photography, which is just a great place to study it because we're not really constrained to hunting season.
Okay. So every time, no matter what the arrow is, slamming 40 pounds onto a flexible arrow is going to cause a bunch of chaos initially until it finds its natural point back to normal in flight. Right.
And what we basically determined was that if you're a hunter, you were better off to overspine the arrow. You're better off if you've been shooting 350 or 400 spine arrow and you're going into a hunting situation and you're going to put some weight on the end of the tip. We didn't see a whole lot of downside with the new bows today and crossbows. Just go ahead and overspine that. Get you a stiff 300 spine arrow.
Okay.
There's a little bit of sacrifice on accuracy, but for the most part with these new bows, you're better off to overspine than underspine.
And that's for the purpose of?
Penetration.
Okay.
Penetration. Even if you hit soft surface at a high speed, that arrow can whiplash back and forth. The other thing you find challenging as a hunter, and we've all taken really, really close shots.
Yep.
If you take a really, really close shot and you've got an underspined arrow or the bow is not tuned very good, that arrow is not flying straight.
Yeah.
And that is we're going to talk about that with broadhead technology. That's the absolute worst thing to have, because whether you pass through that animal or kill that animal or have a successful hunt depends upon the impact. And it's going to depend upon how straight that arrow is flying at the time it impacts that animal.
Okay. I was going to ask, we've all been in close shot situations and they're just not as accurate, it seems, or for whatever reason. So you're saying that, this, because just the pure physics of this whole problem, right? That a close shot can oftentimes not be as accurate a shot simply because of the the way the arrow reacts to getting hit heavy with the string pounding on it.
Yeah, and then the other thing, is your pin gap. Some really, really close shots, your pins aren't that accurate.
Right. That's
even people have advocated that you have to shoot your 20-yard pin when something's 3 yards away. So you see articles like that, and people that have to take professionals that take a lot of close shots, practice those shots, and so that's a good time if you're taking a close shot to have a stiff arrow, to have a well-tuned bow, to have something that's center shot. At that time period, it's real critical that you've got things tuned pretty well. And in today's bows, a good bow, if you shoot a piece of paper out at 5 or 10 feet in front of you, you can see, from a paper tune shot real quick, how good you are.
Yeah.
But in real life, Jay, nothing good happens when you're that close to the animal. There's always something seems to happen.
Yeah, something usually goes wrong when I'm that close. I've never had anything go particularly wrong when they're out 30 yards. But it seems all my problems seem to come when they're inside of 15 for some reason.
Yeah, I'd rather take a 30-yard shot all day long than a 15-yard shot. And then if you add elevation to it, we're going to have to talk about the downside of a mechanical on a tip, shooting from angles from a tree or anything of that nature, because that can really affect your penetration.
Okay. So you're at Rice, you're developing these arrows. Tell me about some of the other advancements that we've looked at since the deeper sleeve insert. What else has come along since then? The quality of the carbon, the carbon that the high grade 40-ton modulus carbon that we traditionally have kind of reserved for the high end, target shooter or the high end arrows has come down market. Price has come down some. We use a lot of 40-ton modulus carbon to make micro diameter arrows. The micro diameter arrow is pretty sensitive in that it needs either some wall thickness or stiffness to be a good hunting arrow. We actually have seen arrows that are 204 IDs and 255, 265, which is considered kind of a small diameter, not quite a micro diameter. We actually, that's where we focused a lot of our attention, at Rice was, and by the way, the objective here at the end of the day is, I know a lot of people are listening, they get pass-through shots, and a lot of people, have been, somewhat successful, but you have to remember the university wanted to completely change the outcome. The reason why we're talking about momentum and speed and accuracy, they wanted to inflict the largest wound possible in a different form or fashion than any broadhead or arrow made. So they really weren't in it to try to get another 10 or 15 feet per second. They weren't in it to try to take a 1.5 inch cut to 1 3/4 or make a mechanical go from 2 inches to 2.5. They were in it to really replicate the ballistics of a bullet. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so when you take a look at a bullet, right, inflicts an entry wound. It inflicts percussion. In other words, it's traveling faster than the speed of sound, so it expands internally. And then it has a different dynamic as it exits an animal. And so they wanted to replicate the down power of a rifle with an arrow.
Okay.
And at the time of the study, you have to recall, there was a big debate in the United States as to how many states were going to allow crossbows. And so you're sitting there academically looking at this saying, we're going to hit 400 feet per second. In fact, with a crossbow and a bow, if it's small brace height or particular cams, we're going to be in the 420, 430, 440. So you think about that from an academic standpoint, that's double the speed we had, a couple decades ago. And, even a 50-pound bow today, is shooting somewhere in the 250 to 280 feet per second. So, speed is not going to be the issue going forward. It's going to be how can you deliver a more impactful trauma to an animal to more humanely take it down.
Okay. Well, let's take a little coffee break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with David Hand from Slash Arrows.
I still can't believe that's all you're taking.
I got everything I need all in one bag.
Rackology Deer Supplement and Attractant, developed through years of intense scientific research, comes a product that puts it all in one bag. Superior attractant, scientifically formulated vitamins and minerals, and all at a much better price. To get yours today, please check out rackology.org for a list of dealers. Rackology, how can you afford not to use it? Everything deer need, all in one bag.
Hunter-friendly coffee retailers are great, but ever wonder where they buy it from? Now there's a company that imports directly from farmers, zero middlemen, roasts it, and ships it right to your door. From the farmer's fields to your morning cup, Hunter's Blend Coffee has been in the hands of hunters. Through their giving, your coffee supports the RMEF, Whitetails Unlimited, and Women's Hunting Associations, and many others. Now you can defend hunting one cup at a time. Not bad for a cup of coffee. And did I mention, it is so good. And now back to our conversation with David Hand from Slash Arrows. So where does speed come into this then? Why is speed important at all?
Well, a couple things. You want to maintain enough speed to drive the arrow down range to maintain momentum. And then secondly, as you reach out in those 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-yard shots, you certainly don't want the animal to jump the string. So,
right.
And the other thing that's coming into play here is with these new bows and these new cams, a properly set up heavy arrow is quieter. And when I say quieter, and also in vibration, you'll see that it cuts them in half. I mean, I'm looking at an arrow here that, it's got some vibration up at the 225 or 230 range, and it's down at 150 with a heavy arrow. So vibration and noise, come way down with a properly tuned heavy arrow.
Okay. So let's, before we get into where we are modern day with all the advancements we've had in the carbon arrow, where we are today, what advancements, or let's just quickly go through the development, the evolution, so to speak, of the broadhead that corresponds maybe going back to that aluminum arrow. What were we throwing on those things in the beginning, and how has that broadhead changed with the arrow technology?
Yeah. What we were basically throwing at them, with an aluminum arrow was most states mandated a 7/8 inch broadhead. The most popular style broadhead that was being used, with the cam bows was a 3-blade broadhead. And there was a lot of folks that liked to align the 3 blades with the fletching.
Right.
And and that was just kind of common knowledge. Let's align it with the fletching.
Right. That's what everybody said. Align it with the fletching.
Yeah.
Yep.
Align it with the fletching. And there were some people that were shooting 75 grain heads and some 125 grain heads, and some people were experimenting with some weight in the front of those aluminum arrows. But that's kind of where we were. And if you take a look at ballistic gel today, and you take a 7/8 inch head and an aluminum arrow, and you just keep throwing it in the ballistic gel, you get 7 or 8 inches of penetration. And we tested all the different broadheads at Rice University. But back then, that's when the states started to adopt, a minimum of 7/8 inch, minimum of 40-pound draw, preferably 50 pounds. Some of the states didn't like big mechanicals because they knew that if the mechanical opened on impact, it would stop the penetration. It wasn't good for bones. A lot of the mechanicals back then, one broadhead would open before the other, so it would steer the arrow left or right, which would decrease the pass-through shots. And so that's kind of how the evolution of the state laws, evolved. I think there were a couple of states back then and still today, like Alaska and some of the big game states, where they like to mandate, a 400 or 500 grain setup or more because they like weight.
Okay.
The broadheads, and you go back and take a look at the intellectual property, it was basically dominated by either a 2-blade head or a 3-blade. And then, of course, people were looking back then at 125 grain, 150 grain, and they were talking about the mechanical advantage. In other words, back then we were real cognizant as to what's the angle of the blade. if the angle of the blade was really low, we'd get more penetration because a low angled, elongated blade would get more penetration.
Right.
And now we stepped away from that. And I'll talk about that. But back then, that was important. And then replaceable blades were important. We didn't have quite the sharpness capabilities we had today, and because of the expense factor, replaceable blades, 3 blades, pretty much dominated it. And then we had 2-blade broadheads that had bleeder blades that came on them that were pretty effective at the time too.
Was it important because it effectively and physically had to go hand in hand with the arrows of the day, the bows of the day, or was it just that's all we knew? That was the most advanced belief that we had at the time.
I think it's a little of both. I think we were running a large ranch down in South Texas, client of mine was, and it was bow hunting only. And I think that, a 7/8 inch broadhead or 1 inch broadhead, if somebody, shot an animal, you generally got to pass through on soft tissue. And if somebody was shooting a 70 or 80 pound bow, you get pretty good penetration through a shoulder. And I think that those brands started to develop, right? We started to get some major branding around some of those 3-blade broadheads, and some IP got locked in there. And then we started to look at different tips, trocar tips, and then we had some flight patterns that were more favorable towards the shape of the blades. And so that IP got locked in and those brands got locked in. And I think we kept with some of those ideas a little too long. Okay.
All right. And when did we start to abandon some of those ideas, or not abandon, but change those beliefs where you said you think we went too long? When does that start to change?
I want to think that, in the early 90s, we started to see a fair amount of intellectual property around mechanicals.
Okay.
And I think that the evolution of the cams, the bows weren't shooting, quite as smooth as they are today. And so the consumer was a little frustrated if they had a broadhead that was 1 inch or 1 inch and a 16th or a little bit bigger. They weren't getting quite the flight that they were. So the consumer started to say, I could buy a mechanical and shoot it and not have to tune it. That's kind of where I think that was the evolution of mechanicals. And, most of the mechanicals back then were predicated on just a 2-blade cut, which, had some upside and some downside.
Okay. All right. So where did we advance from there?
I think where we advanced from there to the folks that were in the mechanical broadhead space were starting to say, we need to really take a look at what happens on impact. Can we have a front deploying mechanical, a rear deploying mechanical? Can we put some slots in the blade such that if it is left or right, we've got a little bit of play so that it takes a more perpendicular flight into the animal? I think at the same time, we were starting to get better bow sights. There was certainly a lot of advocacy towards shot placement because now we're starting to get 3D targets that have heart and lungs on them, and people are starting to stay off that shoulder bone.
Right.
And so, so I think the thing that happened is everybody that was shooting a mechanical realized, gosh, the last thing you want to do is hit bone, whether it be a rib or a shoulder or a spine. These mechanicals, fly real well and they fly real fast, but, it's a soft tissue shot.
Okay.
And then I think then your fixed blade folks were starting to say, could we change the tip? Could we make them a little larger? Could we standardize them at 100 grains? Could we elongate the blades a little bit? Can we do some things where the blades are actually being held such that the airflow going across there actually can stabilize it? Which there's a lot of IP and patent around that. And so you started to see some fixed blades shoot pretty good. And then about that same time, the bows, of course, got so much better that, the tuning problem got to be less of an issue.
Right. Okay. Where are we today with the arrows and today's modern broadheads as far as the ballistics relative to hunting? You've done some classes or some presentations on this, but I think this is the part where we should really focus on, because this is the technology that hunters are getting into right now.
Yeah, so when we looked at the mechanicals and we looked at the fixed broadheads and then we looked at the arrows, we said, there's a real real mistake here being made in that we know that from a broadhead technology standpoint, when you enter an animal, there's probably nothing better than a fixed broadhead. I mean, or fixed object. I mean, it's just at that point, you're traveling at a very, very high speed. And if you want to just 100% of the time not make a problem on entry, it's better to have something fixed and hard. And that's what a bullet does, right? A bullet says, we're going down range, and gosh, the first thing we want to do is enter past the bone, past the hide, past the ribs, and we want to expand. Then the bullet says we want to expand internally, and then we want to exit as large an exit wound as we can. And it's a whole lot easier to go out the back side of a shoulder or the back side of a rib than going in. And that's something you need to remember. It's a whole lot easier to go out of an animal than to go into an animal.
Well, that's a funny statement. I mean, it seems contradictory. So can you dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, the whole shape of any animal's outside structure is protection, right? So the hide, the bones, the cartilage, everything is designed to keep something from coming in. We shoot a lot of hogs here in Texas, and gosh, from the neck all the way back, it's got very thick cartilage and a lot of protection and protecting the cavity. Even the humans have a lot of flesh and ribs and protection and shoulders to protect our heart and lungs, and that's the same with all animals. But once you get inside of an animal and you're on the back side of a rib, that rib is pretty susceptible to a trocar tip or a fixed object that could either go left or right of it or break it. So it's a whole lot easier going out than coming in. So that's why it's important to maintain momentum in the shot.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. Momentum. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Yep. And so what we learned about penetration is that when we did all the tests on the broadheads, for the most part, you sit there and you shoot a 1-inch broadhead all day long, and in ballistic gel at 40 foot-pounds, it goes 7 inches, and maybe a great broadhead goes 7.2 and 7.4 and 7.6. Really nothing exciting there. You may have something, a 3-blade broadhead that has some low angles, and it's a little more efficient through the ballistic gel. Maybe it'll go, 8 inches, but it's almost a commodity. So what we found out was that for every 16th or 32nd of an inch that you drop in the cutting diameter of your fixed broadhead, you pick up a tremendous amount of penetration. For example, there's a whole lot better penetration when a 7/8 inch broadhead than one that's 1 1/8 inch, especially if you're short draw and low poundage.
Okay, so the smaller the distance of the broadhead, the more penetration.
Right. The smaller the diameter of it, the more penetration. And so, our whole objective here is to get past the hide and the bone. And so we started to say, a hybrid doesn't work because a hybrid broadhead is all at the tip. And so all it's going to do is make a little bit of cut and then open mechanically, and you're still going to put the brakes on. We started to think in terms of, let's go back to that 7/8 inch broadhead or 1-inch 3-blade broadhead, and then let's enter the animal. And then how far does it take for an arrow to stabilize? And, we looked at this. It takes about 3 or 4 or 5 inches of penetration before that arrow is really stabilized and kind of stopped all its movement of hitting the object.
Okay.
We said, wouldn't that be the optimum time to flip out a couple of mechanical blades? So we started to think in terms in theory, let's put a 7/8 inch broadhead on the end of the arrow. Let's let it get in the animal from a theory standpoint, 2, 3, 4 inches, and then let's pop open 2 real large mechanicals. And what does that do for penetration?
Gotcha. All right.
So we said, well, let's go back to the beginning. Let's take a heavy arrow. Let's make sure we have plenty of momentum. Let's put a new fixed blade broadhead on there that's a 1 3/16, which is, got a pretty good cutting radius.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's use an arrow that's somewhere around 350 grains. And this is in the ATA study we did. And we would get, about 7 inches of penetration.
Gotcha.
And we said, okay, and we had a fairly, a 1 3/16 inch 3-blade broadhead or 2-blade broadhead or mechanical. That's a pretty nice size cut, but nothing that's devastating academically. And also, it's really kind of a one-time shock, right? I mean, you're hitting the animal, and then that's kind of it. In a bullet, you hit the animal twice, right? You hit it on entry, and then a few milliseconds later, there's a second blast.
Yep.
And the second blast is pretty detrimental to your central nervous system. By the time you're hit, your blood pressure's up, your vitals are hit, your nervous system's at high alert. Could we do a second trauma shot? And so we shoot this arrow 1 3/16 traditional 3-blade broadhead. We have a 350 grain arrow on it. It's at 40 pounds of kinetic energy. We're getting 7 inches. So then we said, let's drop that entry from 1 3/16 to 7/8, and then about 4 inches behind that, let's put 2 blades in there that make a 2-inch cut.
Yep.
A 2-inch mechanical. Let's make sure that it's at a low angle. Let's make sure it's below 40 degrees. Make sure it's at 35, 32 degrees, because we know that's a mechanical advantage.
Okay.
Then let's up the weight. Instead of shooting 350 grains, let's kind of up it to in the 400 range, because that's when we start to see that momentum jump from, 10 to 14. It's kind of the difference between the bowling ball and, just a basketball.
Right.
And so now we're getting 11 inches of penetration, and we're getting a huge wound channel because we've cut a 7/8 inch hole, and then we come behind it with a 2-inch hole. And it's pretty easy to make a 2-inch hole after you've already made a 1-inch hole or 7/8 inch hole.
Yep.
So we were able to get twice the wound volume with the same bow in the same poundage. And we picked up 4 inches of penetration, which meant we went from a deep shot in an animal to a pass through.
Let me ask a quick question. If I'm thinking about this in my head correctly, are you losing any speed and accuracy because of that? And accuracy, I mean by duck and the arrow kind of thing.
I think when you take a look at that ATA study, we were shooting, around 250 feet per second,
mm-hmm.
and we dropped it down to 225.
Okay, so not a lot.
So not a lot. And our thinking there was, and that's on a slow bow, that's on somebody shooting 40 or 45 pounds. Those types of folks are taking close shots anyway.
Yeah.
When we took a look at the higher speeds, we'll talk about that in a minute, but sacrificing 20 or 30 feet per second when you're taking a 20 or 25 yard shot and you're only shooting 40 pounds and you're only drawing, in fact, these were done with all the women's bows, and you're only drawing 25 or 26 inches, you're probably not out there reaching at 30 and 40 yards anyway.
Right.
On a trophy animal.
Right. Okay. So the lower poundage bows overall.
Yeah, that was the lower poundage study, and then we're going to go to the crossbow and the high speed bow in a minute. But so that if there are any questions about what we're trying to do there is we were on the bottom end there, working with what the state regulations were, what we knew would work, dropping that broadhead down from 1 3/16 to 7/8 or an inch, and then up in the weight in the right proportionate way. Now we're at a front of center now at about 18, right? We're pretty heavy front of center, but we've put the weight behind the broadhead, not on the tip of the arrow.
Right.
So we picked up accuracy.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
We actually are more accurate. We're 25 feet per second slower, but we're more accurate.
Okay. Yep. So it's not all weight forward. It's kind of semi-distributed behind.
Right. It's distributed. You're absolutely right, because we're putting the weight behind that broadhead, not on the tip.
Gotcha.
I mean, I wouldn't have advocated putting 175 grains on the tip of an arrow for somebody shooting, 40 pounds. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? I mean,
right.
It's defeating the purpose.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So then you tested some, not compound, you tested some higher speed arrows or higher speed bows.
Yeah. So now we're stepping up into the mid range, person shooting that 60, 65 pound bow, shooting at 310 feet per second, type of environment. And so we said, one of the things we have to do here is, when you get up into that range, can you still have the momentum with this device and not lose the speed? Instead of using a 7/8 inch broadhead, we'll go to an inch broadhead. Instead of having a 2-inch cut, maybe we can go to 2 1/4 or 2.5 inch. Lay the blades back a little bit. Let's step that weight up from that 380 grains to 450 grains. Let's see how much speed we'll lose. And what we found out is that you could make a product that's in that 11 grain per inch category, and most 11 grain per inch per arrows were shooting out of the bows we were testing 290 feet per second.
Okay.
And because this weight wasn't on the tip, and because it was distributed, and we used high carbon 40-ton modulus carbon, and we were doing some things there, this arrow would shoot 305 feet per second. So, we're giving up a little bit of speed on the top end. I mean, we're not shooting 330 feet per second, but we're not shooting 290. We're shooting about 305, and so it was a good balance, right? I mean, we found that let's don't go way up in the 500 and 600 grains, but let's kind of stay in that mid 400s. Let's put a 1-inch cut on the front of that, and that could be any 1-inch cut. There's a lot of people making good 1-inch cut 3-blade or 2-blade broadheads. And then how much blade can we get away with in the shaft? We could probably bump it up to 2 1/4 inch with low angle blades, and still get a lot of pass through. And you have to remember, those mechanicals never see the in entry. They're completely closed. And they're completely closed for the first 4 inches.
Right.
So you've got somewhat of a free ride, right? You're acting just like a small 3-blade, in entry.
Yeah,
which is what
you're along for the ride until you get to your landing spot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and then we didn't slow down to 290 feet per second. We still stayed up at 305, and that's pretty acceptable. And then you step up to the extreme when you've got people shooting, 360s, 370s, 385s, in the 72, 73 pound boat range, and they've got 5 1/4 inch brace height bows. What we noticed there is that they sacrificed some speed, but they picked up a tremendous amount of accuracy. And when they were making longer shots at 50, 60, 70 yards, the arrow wasn't as susceptible to slow down due to wind or crosswinds, because you're still projecting a pretty heavy projectile out there.
Yeah. Makes sense. Like a heavier bullet will pass through more obstruction because it's heavier. Right.
Yeah, it's heavier. And we noticed that, if we lighten the design a whole bunch, out there at 50, 60, 70 yards, it started to slow down pretty quick, right? So between 50 and 70 yards, we got a lot of drop out of a light arrow. It just kind of lost some of its luster because of the friction.
Right.
Now there are some folks using some low profile vanes. That helped.
Okay.
Smaller diameter shaft helped. Drop away rest, a good drop away rest helped. I mean, you start using all those things that we have today, and it works.
Did you test anything with like the whisker biscuit? That seems to be still a popular type rest. It seems, but that causes friction. Did you see any kind of testing done there?
When we were testing slash arrows, because we're already up in that 11 and 12 grains per inch era, we're not seeing a lot of loss of speed out of those friction of those types of devices.
Okay. All right.
I mean, you're just in a different class. I mean, once you step up to a slash era, and you're shooting in that 400 plus grain range, and you're shooting, 17, 18% FOC, those small little things don't really slow you down.
They don't matter. Okay.
They don't matter that much.
Gotcha. All right. Anything else you want to touch on that kind of like a take home overall statement?
I guess my 2 take homes are that whatever arrow you were shooting, if you're shooting anything under 400 grains, and you should know what you're shooting, I'd advocate any hunter take a look at a heavier arrow and a more front of center. And the other thing I'd advocate to everybody's listening, since I've done a lot of patents, the patent laws have changed quite a bit. And if you've got a good idea, before you tell anybody, before you start doing a lot of R&D on it, you can go download a provisional patent, and write down what your idea is, file it. And that at least, stops the clock in time. So it allows you later on, if you develop it, you can do that. And that's what I did. I certainly came up with these ideas nearly 10 years ago, and we wrote them down on paper and didn't do anything with them until we were sure we could get the intellectual property behind it.
Gotcha. So I know that this might be hard to predict, but what's the future? Where does this keep going?
I think that the future is going to be, I think on crossbows, it's going to be mandated that you have to have something over 500 grains. I mean, we're seeing so much better downrange penetration and flight, even with high-speed crossbows. They're going to go to really heavy arrows. I think they're going to be in excess of 20% FOC.
Okay.
And I think the archery market's going to follow it, and I think there's going to be lots of hybrid designs. And I think that the hybrid designs that are going to succeed are either going to be in the arrow shaft or they're going to be elongated. And I think that we're going to have to throw out this 100 grain rule that, broadhead's got to weigh 100 grains. I think that's got to go away again. I think people have got to start looking at, if you shoot a light poundage bow, I think you need to be shooting 60 or 70 grains with the weight behind it. And if you're shooting, something that's real heavy and real poundage, you can go up to 125, 150, 175. I think we just got to get off of this notion that 100 grains is a sweet spot.
Right. And that seems to be the current standard, so to speak, that everybody believes.
And you can do that. We all our arrows work with a 100 grain head, but you need another 50 or 60 grains behind it, and you need a secondary cut.
Yeah.
Secondary trauma is what kills an animal.
Right.
I think we all know as a hunter, we'd like to be able to shoot something and watch it drop in its tracks, and that can be done.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right. Well, I really appreciate that you've taken this on and you're engaging this in a study at a educational facility that is backing you to say, yeah, this is worthwhile. I think this is very fascinating.
Yeah, and then we think that Slash has got a lot of upside, and it's been around for 5 years tested, and we're getting a lot of progress in it, and so we hope you guys are able to check it out.
So tell me, as I'm thinking about this, we talked a lot about academic stuff. Tell me more about Slash. What is Slash, and how is it connected to you?
Yeah, when we came up with all the patents, the basic idea was that you could put long blades inside of an arrow shaft. And of course, the arrow shaft has to be lined with aluminum and carbon and strengthened and things of that nature. So Slash develops a full product, a crossbolt and an arrow. Comes right out of the box. You can screw any broadhead you want on it. We actually equip it with a 3-blade broadhead that some that are 60 and 75 because they're just not made in the market anymore. And it penetrates about 3.5 to 4 inches, and then right behind it, inside the shaft, 2 mechanicals open internal to the animal. It's very important to know it's internal because I know we have a lot of listeners that don't like mechanicals, and I don't like mechanicals because they're not dependable on the tip of an arrow. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Slash has the intellectual property and brand. It's sold all around the country. It holds the 16th largest stag in the world. It's been very successful in elk and big game. And we've brought it down market at a very economical price of about $50, a little over $50 for broadheads and a set of arrows. It's ready to shoot out of the box, and it's very effective. It's the only device that works like a bullet. It's going to give you the secondary shock trauma, and it's only going to open internally. And it's going to give you the accuracy of a fixed blade on impact.
Gotcha. Very cool. So, David, let's shift gears here and get into a deer hunting story. I know you said you had a decent one to tell when we were in our pregame chat.
Yeah, I think that we all take for granted how dangerous it can be hunting wild game. And I have to tell you a funny story because in Texas, the most exciting thing to do is to rattle. I mean, if you can get on a free-range ranch, middle of rut, and rattle a buck in, he has no senses, and if there's another buck around, they're going to fight. And, I've done it with elk too, but it's just incredibly exciting to see what happens when you rattle. And I was rattling with my brother-in-law, and we never could quite get this big buck in this one particular spot. So I had him rattling about 30, 40 yards from me, and I was we were in a field, and he would come across that field. The only thing in that field was really a tree. So I was standing behind the tree waiting for the buck to come. And he didn't make it. And so I shot at the doe. And the doe went running down the same trail my brother-in-law was. And he didn't really look up. He was down rattling. About the time he looked up, this doe hit him like a bowling ball and just knocked him completely down. And, luckily he didn't get hurt. But so I don't think I've ever heard of anybody being, actually run over by a deer hunting. But you get down here in South Texas in the middle of a rut, it can happen.
Yeah. I can see it happening. Like, I'm sure it happens. I just don't hear about it a whole lot. But yeah.
And then to tell the story how they got stampeded by a doe, right?
Right. Yeah. Nobody wants to share that. So, but I can see it happen. I mean, why wouldn't it? That's crazy. All right, David, I've got 10 rapid fire questions for you here.
Okay.
All right. What's your number one hunting tip of all time?
My number one hunting tip of all time is probably scent.
Okay.
Yep.
Very good. We all have these things that...
Besides the momentum of an arrow, which we spent an hour talking about.
Right. Besides the hour we just spent on it.
Yeah.
We all have these devices that we feel are very important other than your weapon, and if we leave it at home or in the truck when we're in the stand, it drives us crazy if we don't have it. Do you have one of those devices, and if so, what is that?
I have a pistol, and I always forget it. And if you're shooting hogs,
yep,
or any wild game, that and the other thing I have, and everybody has one, is a knife.
Yep.
And I forget that. I think that's just so important.
Right. And you just can't stop thinking about, I forgot my knife. Or
Yep.
Yep. I hear you. What's your biggest pet peeve in life?
I think the biggest pet peeve is really has to do with how slow it is to change the consumer. Mm-hmm. We've had all these things. We've known all these things along the line. And I'm a real advocate for, the consumer embracing, something that seems to be pretty simple and new technologies. And I think it's just been really, really slow. It's taken a decade to get this, some of these concepts going. But now when I open some of the trade publications, I'm starting to see them.
Gotcha. Very good. All right. How old are you today?
61.
61. All right. What would you tell the 30-year-old David Hand, knowing what you know today?
Oh, gosh. Probably if you're going to do something that's monumental, start it early in life. If you've got an idea, don't sit on it for 20 or 30 years. You just need to do it. And just persistence. If there's one thing that, I do, you just have to be persistent.
Wow.
Sometimes you don't have to be the smartest, and sometimes you don't have to be the most wealthy or the luckiest, but you just got to step up and do it. So if you've got an idea, I'd encourage you to write it down on a piece of paper, file it, get a provisional patent, and follow through with it, because it's a whole lot easier at age 30 to take a bunch of risk.
Yeah. I'm with you. I am a big fan of persistence. Like you say, you don't have to be the smartest, you don't have to be the richest, but persistence will outpace all that stuff.
Well, Jay, you're doing exactly one of the things that you need to be doing. You're advocating a sport that could virtually, die before our eyes in the next couple of decades. You're advocating the best way to do it.
Right.
I can't commend you enough. Without grassroots efforts like this, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen on television anymore. It's not going to, you can't clearly delineate the message on social media. So, Jay, I really just commend you for the ability to make a difference.
I appreciate that. It means a lot. And, we're going to do it whether we're recognized for that or not. But, that at the end of the day, that's really the goal. We want to keep these things alive. All right, couple more questions. You meet a stranger at a hotel lobby at a hunting convention somewhere in the world, and they ask you what you do for a living. What would you tell them?
I often start out by saying that I'm in the sports and hunting archery technology business. But if I have to give if it's at ATA, I'll say that, I'm president CEO of /Arrow is the only arrow that's ever been invented that can, actually, produce ballistics like a bullet.
Gotcha. Yep. Very good. And let's see, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
Boy, you are not going to believe this. My wife outshot me 2 days ago. For every one dove I shot, she shot 5.
Yeah.
And so I actually took the day off today and had fried dove and scrambled eggs.
Fried dove and scrambled eggs.
Hopefully Thanksgiving it'll be quail.
You're the first person to give us that answer for breakfast. I'll give you that. That's pretty neat. I've never heard that before. That's great. All right. So you get your own billboard on the side of a highway. It's a blank canvas. You can put anything you want on it. What would it say?
Now that we're coming to Thanksgiving, I'd probably say, God bless America.
Very nice. If I say the word successful to you, who's the first person that pops into your head and why?
My wife.
Excellent. Very good answer. What's a typical day in your life look like?
I have a 9-to-5 job just like everybody else. And I get up every morning, read the newspaper, spend time with my wife, go to the office. I'm in the financial services business. Mm-hmm. And then, my waking hours at noon and on the weekends, and about one day a week, we do development work for technology in the archery business.
Very cool. And then finally, what's a deer hunting day in your life look like?
Yeah, those are fewer and far between, but probably the day after Thanksgiving, either quail hunting or rattling in a big buck in South Texas. That's probably it.
Gotcha. Very good. All right. Those are the 10 rapid fire questions. I really, really appreciate you coming on and going through all this deep rooted science and technology that you're developing and looking at. And I appreciate all the work you put into it. And if for some reason we've left some question unturned, or if we've just somehow developed more questions than answers, where can people find you at Slash, or just reach out to you on the interwebs and if they have more questions?
Yeah, it's slasharrows.com. I think it's a pretty easy trade name to remember because the blade's actually slash
right
animal, and that's how we got the trademark. So just go to our website and Facebook, and give us as many comments as you can, and we encourage you just to try it. I think that it's overdue. I think you've spent a lot of money on bows and a lot of things on technology. I think it's time you changed your broadhead and your arrow.
Very nice. Well, David, this has been an honor and a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And we may have to have you back on a second round, maybe on a BBR Live on like a Thursday night, because that's starting to open up again. And I think showing off some of this technology we've talked about on video would be very cool. And I'll even let you have a few moments to comb your hair.
Okay, I appreciate that. I won't look like the Nutty Professor next time we're on live. Thank you.
Thanks to David Hand for joining us on the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast. It was quite a journey that we just took down Arrow and Broadhead Lane. It's nice to see where we're at, and David definitely has one of those innovative designs, and he certainly knows his stuff, as I'm sure he showed you over the last hour. Dusty, do we have a Chubby Tines tip of the week?
Yeah, Jay, we do. And
the Chubby Tines tip of the week is sponsored by Morse's Sporting Goods. Firearms, used firearms, bows, used bows, located at 85 Kentucky Falls Road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Give Jim a call at 603-464-3444, morsessportinggoods.com. Your dollars go further in New Hampshire. There's no sales tax. Morse's Sporting Goods.
We're going to get into a little bit about a scenario that, over the multi years of being out there, I've just picked up on this, and it's kind of simple, but yet it's to the point. And there's going to be some that may disagree or agree, but here in the Midwest, we're hunting a lot of fields, and obviously we have crops, soybeans, corn, and opportunity for food plots. So with that being said, a lot of these young bucks are going to come out and they're going to be in these fields, these crop fields, and the does are going to be in these crop fields, and you're really going to see a lot of deer activity in the fields. Now, let's say you got standing corn and maybe the farmer left you an acre up and you paid for it or whatever, and you're in there and you're hunting the standing corn, and you got all these young bucks and does are all kind of congregating out in the open. And you're focused on that because that's the natural mental stage, is to focus where the deer are. But in reality, that back trail where the mature bucks are exiting or entering that food source, let's say it's standing corn or a soybean field, if you're focused on where everybody's hanging out, that's probably not where you want to be. You want to be on that back trail. And what I mean by that is you catch an area where the deer is either exiting or entering on the back side of this piece where they're feeding. And the mature bucks will skirt back in and out of there. And sometimes it's overlooked because, you just think it's a trail that everybody's using. Well, in reality, the mature buck's coming on the back trail, and he's going there and he's eating, and maybe it's on a little bit of a knoll you can't see on the backside. Well, he'll come in there, he'll graze around, eat on that knoll, check things out, see if there's a hot doe in the area, and he'll slide back out, and you'll never see him. So keep that in mind when you go and set up on a spot. Just because all the deer are congregating to one area doesn't mean that's where you want to hunt. You need to focus on where that mature buck's taking a back trail and sliding in and out of there without you knowing it. So keep that in mind when you hunt mature bucks. They're going to do the unthinkable, and they're going to not follow the young bucks and the does. They're going to come in there on the sneak. They're going to be real sneaky about it. They're going to get in there. They're going to check things out. They're going to feed, and they're going to get out of there. And if you focus on that back trail or the backside of that feed plot, somewhere maybe you can't get a visual from where you're at now, get back there and check that out. I guarantee your success rate will go up by at least 30% by hunting that back trail.
And that, my friends, is the truth. Great tip, Dusty. Dusty, where can we find you when you're not hanging out here in the studios with me?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. You can look me up on Instagram and Twitter @ChasingAntler, Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Jay, where can the people reach out to you when you're not on the mic?
Likewise, you can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com, and you can visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Instagram, instagram.com/bigbuckregistry, and YouTube, which is youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. On YouTube, you can listen to all of our podcasts in their entirety. As far as videos are concerned, it's a boring video, but the audio content is there, so you can actually listen to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our live shows that we've done on Thursday nights when we do them, and we've gone back and re-interviewed a lot of our previous guests we had on the show just to put a face to a voice, let's put it that way. You can always listen to our show on other places as well, not just YouTube. We're found on Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. And if you would like to submit a buck to our page for consideration and be featured on our page in front of 250,000 diehard deer hunting fans, all you have to do is go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and all of the instructions will be right there. I think that's pretty much everywhere we're at. I think that's a wrap, Dusty.
That's a whole lot of big buck, Jay.
Sure is. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.